Hello and welcome to another course about the English. This time I'm Grandmaster Damian Lemos, so welcome to the intro to the English opening after one c4 by white. So I'll do my best to narrow the lines down to make it easier for you to understand this opening. What I like about the English opening is the fact we do have to know some theory, but actually the most important part is understanding the ideas. If we know what we're doing, then we're guaranteed a great outcome out of the opening, and the game, we usually get an easy to play middle game for white. Maybe that's an overstatement, but it is easy to play. I find the English an easy opening to play, so hopefully I can demonstrate that in this course. So let's get started. We open up with c4. The other thing I like about the English is that no matter how black plays, we usually have a lot of flexibility as white. When we play d4 as white, we're likely to continue with c4. We probably end up in a King's Indian or Queen's Gambit. When we play the English, though, we haven't played d4 yet, so as we'll see in the Rabbinic system, which is the first line we'll look at, we might play d3 in a lot of positions, and if required, we can still play d4. So black doesn't really know whether we'll play d4, d3. In other words, we are super flexible as white. And now talking about black's possibilities here after c4, well, he can play in so many different ways. He can play the King's Indian, he can play with e6 and d5, sort of a Queen's Gambit declined. He can play in a Slav fashion with c6 and d5, he can play c5, which would be the symmetrical English. So we'll take a look at all of the setups black can play, and we have some transpositions too. In the main game, the game we'll start analyzing black plays with e5, which is the reversed Sicilian. If black plays e5, we can still get a King's Indian, because after all, black can still play knight f6, g6, bishop g7. The same happens if he goes knight f6, g6, bishop g7, and eventually he plays e5. So we'll focus on setups, because if we focus our study on move by move, then we'll end up crazy, because yeah, I mean, it's better to focus on setups, trust me on this one. Alright, so let me show you a few move orders where we can get the Rabbinic setup, and then we'll start analyzing the game. First, let's see what happened in the main game. You'll find in the PGN files, which is Hansen against Hayaram. In that game, white played c4, of course, black plays e5. Alright, so here, later on in this course, we'll see d3 is the move I like. In the game, white plays g3, knight f6, bishop g2. As usual, in the English opening with fianchetto, we try to take over the center, and here we'll get the Rabbinic setup. Black plays g6, knight c3, bishop g7, and here I like e4. Now, white can also play e3 and knight e2. This is a completely different system. It's interesting as well. I do like e4 because we build up our center. It is true that our bishop is now on a closed diagonal, but as we'll see, controlling the center is great for us, and we're still building up our center and position. The other key here is that our knight goes to e2. That's another benefit of white's move order. The knight goes to e2, and we'll be able in future to play something like f4. Okay, so after e4, black castles, white plays knight to e2, and now we'll play d3, we'll castle, and we get the rabbinic setup. So this is a potential move order. Now let's see another one. After c4, black could play something like knight f6. Okay, here we play g3, black plays g6, bishop g2, bishop g7, knight c3. Again, we get our pieces out. We don't play knight f3 yet. I mean, we could, it's totally fine. But if we want to play the rabbinic setup, we have to keep our knight on g1 so we can play e4 and knight e2. So knight c3, castles, e4. Now he's likely to play d6 here. I'm sorry about that sound. Knight g2, now e5, and we still get the rabbinic setup. There are other lines where black can play c5 as well. We'll take a look at that too. So the other move order I can think of after c4 is black playing c5, g3. Here we get the symmetrical English, but we'll see that we can still get the rabbinic setup here after knight c3. Again, we don't play knight f3 yet because we want to play knight e2. Knight c6, e4. Okay, here black plays e5. He can play e6, d6. He can play knight f6 as well. It doesn't really matter because we'll still play knight e2. It doesn't affect our strategy, that's what I mean. Okay, and here again we get the rabbinic setup. Solid center, knight on e2, and we get chances on the king side by playing f2, f4. The other thing we can try doing here, and we'll study this in more detail, not only we can play on the king side, we can also play on the queen side with rook b1, a3, and b4. So the rabbinic setup, it's great, especially if you're playing for a win, because you get every single piece on board and you get a straightforward plan as white. We get play both on the king side and queen side. Alright, so now that we know the potential move orders, now let's focus on the rabbinic setup and let's see some examples, let's see some games. Alright, so the first game, as I mentioned, black played e5. We'll take a look at d3, which is the line I like against the reverse Sicilian. In this game we get the rabbinic setup. It was played via this move order, so let's take a look. Here I like e4, castles, knight to e2, black plays d6. In this game white plays d3. We can castle as well. I don't think it makes a huge difference because we can castle and play d3 next. There's not much black can do to stop it, so and the same goes after d3. Black, what is he going to do? We'll castle next move, he can't really stop it, so the move order doesn't make a big difference. We'll take a look at both moves, but again, we have to focus on the resulting positions and the ideas. The move order here doesn't matter much, in my opinion, so let's see what happened in this game where white played d3 and black plays knight bd7. There are other ideas. When it comes to the King's Indian, we know black has so many options to consider. He can try playing something like c5, which is, it looks like a copycat because he's basically placing the pawns on the same squares as our pawns. There's a difference though. If he goes c5 here, he doesn't have a knight on e7, he does have a knight on f6, so in spite of that position being symmetrical, we do have a break on the king side with f4, and at some point, this is what we are trying to achieve in this line. We can try f4, f5, hopefully we can try playing something like h3 as well. h3 is always a useful move by white because we control g4 and we also support our kingside expansion. So that's one thing worth noting. That knight on f6 is not ideal for black because whenever we go f4, it would be okay for black to have f5 handy. I'm not saying he has to play f5, but if he's got that knight on f6 and that knight stays there, it's gonna be easy for us to play f4, f5, h3, g4, and we can consider g5 as well. We keep on rolling on the king side, and black has basically no counterplay. So you'll see a lot of games where black tries something like knight e8 and f5 just to make sure he's got some sort of reaction on the king side. So coming back to this position after d3, c5 maybe, knight c6 is another move. Again, black tries a different setup. Maybe he wants to play something like knight d7, knight c5, knight e6, and eventually jumping to d4. He can try something like c6, trying to play d5. We'll see. This is not a great idea because we've got so many pieces controlling the d5 square. So again, black has a lot of ways of playing this, and we'll look at lines to see how it plays out in practice. I'll mention the last idea before in case I forget. Black could try something like bishop e6. This is an idea I see a lot in blitz games, in online games. Getting the bishop out, trying to play something like queen c8 and trade our bishop on g2. We'll mention this concept soon in other lines too, but I'll mention it now too, just in case. If black plays this idea, let's say he goes queen c8, bishop h3, it looks great for him, but actually it's a bad idea. It's not great for him because let's say we castle, he goes queen c8. Now f4 happens to be the best move, but I'll just play a random move to prove my point. Let's say I go rook b1, whatever, b3, a3. I'll just let him execute his idea. Alright, bishop h3, let's say I just play b3, whatever. He takes, king takes. Now if you think about it, that bishop on e6 was his best bishop. On the other hand, bishop g7 is crashing into the pawn chain. That bishop is not great. And if we think about bishop g2, it was an okay bishop, but it wasn't the greatest bishop ever. I mean, if we now place our pawns on light squares, bishop g2 would have been a bad bishop, and bishop c1 on the other hand is a great bishop because it has a lot of diagonals, and black on the other hand is left with a bad bishop, and white has more space. We're dominating on light squares. So if you think about it, this bishop e6, queen c8, this trade helped us. It didn't help black at all. And not to mention, and I had this happened in a lot of my games, after this trade, our kingside attack is now easier to execute because we'll play h3, f4, f5. Black has no easy way to control light squares. So it looks great for black, but actually, if you let him play that, we are fine. That's a concept worth noting, and it took me years to learn this. So some players, you'll see some players here playing something like h3, trying to stop black from playing queen c8 and bishop here. Even, alright, queen d7, queen c8, same idea. If we play h3 now, he goes queen d7, we won't be able to castle because then that pawn is hanging, so it's not as easy to play. For white, we can probably try something else, maybe bishop e3, queen d2, we can delay kingside castling. But again, I don't think we have to stop him from playing queen d7 and bishop h3, because again, that's a trade that's helping us from that positional point of view. So we'll come back to this line later. First, I want to see what happened in the game where black played knight bd7. I would call this the pure King's Indian style. He plays e5, he plays knight bd7. This is what a King's Indian player would play against the Middlegames setup. So we castle, now black plays a5, again another King's Indian-like move. He wants to play knight c5, he wants to make sure he controls b4. So here we play h3. I like it. Now we do have a reason to play h3. We want to control the g4 square. We are likely to play something like bishop e3, so we don't want to meet any knight g4s by black. And also, once we play h3, as I mentioned before, we'll be able to play f4, f5, we might play g4 as well. It's important to play h3. We'll have situations where a move like f4 works. However, I prefer playing h3 first, as a rule of thumb. Again, we might play f4 in some positions and it might be okay. Just in case, he might have stuff based on knight g4, queen b6. Well, this is not the greatest example of that because black has nothing here. But just to be safe, I like being careful. And anyways, h3 is a move we have to play at some point. Trust me, if you see a lot of games in the Middlegames system, you'll find that usually white has a pawn on h3. So here, black plays c6, bishop to e3. We keep on getting our pieces out. We'll make sure we finish our development. Here it would be great for us to play something like queen d2, rook d1, and then we'll consider d4 or f4. And honestly, I feel white is much better here. We have much more space. Our pieces coordination is excellent, couldn't be better. And black, on the other hand, has no space. I don't see any reaction for him. I mean, he cannot play something like b5, d5, f5 looks risky for him. And we'll see examples where black plays something like f5 when the center is volatile, so we'll see. Here black plays queen c7, queen d2. Again, we make sure every single piece is participating in the attack, in the game, and then we'll play something like f4. So here black plays knight c5, and now white goes f4. We could play something else, but I think now it is time to play the aggressive move f4, because the last piece we have to bring into the game is that rook on a1. And yes, we could play rook d1, because maybe in future we can consider d4, but I think f4 is better here because we can move that rook on a1 in one step later on. What I mean is we can play maybe rook f2 and rook a f1, so we don't want to waste the move playing rook d1 and then rook f1. That would take 2 steps to play. So f4, I think we've got an excellent development to play f4 and hopefully f5, g4, and the show continues. Alright, so here black plays b6. We can see that black is already struggling here. The reason he plays b6 is that here we've got a threat. Not only we've got the threat of playing f5, we also have pawn takes e5, and that wins a piece. So black has to protect that knight on c5. If he takes on f4, he's got other issues here. This is funny because if you check this with an engine, regardless of how we retake on f4, we've got a clear advantage as white. Usually I like taking with a pawn, because then we'll have d4, e5. I mean, we've got everything going for us. As white, you can play knight g3 to overprotect that pawn on e4 as well. But yeah, black is in deep trouble here. Now, if he doesn't take, as we mentioned, we can consider taking on e5. If that knight on c5 is not hanging, you can just play f5, g4, and it is a one-sided game on the king side for us, and black has basically no reaction. In the game, after b6, white played rook a1. I feel f5, that's what I would have played as white. But in reality, yeah, there's not much black can do to stop f5 unless he takes here. But then again, we just take back with the pawn. So black plays bishop a6. Another super solid move by white, just in case, excuse me, we protect the pawn on c4. And now we play f5. So this is a dream for white. This is what we are trying to achieve when we play the rabbinic setup. That's why I chose this game to start the course, because it shows what we're looking for when we play this system. So black takes. I feel black is lost here. I'll say it. After f5. In practice, if white plays well, I feel black is close to losing already, because it's got no counterplay. And we'll just keep on rolling on the king side. Our attack is unstoppable. And that explains why black took on f5, which is an ugly move from the positional point of view. But if he doesn't, then we'll just keep on pushing our pawns on the king side. So black takes, now we take with the rook. He's got so many weaknesses on the king side now. He goes bishop c8, rook f2. Now g4, knight g3. Our attack's still there. The only thing that has changed here is the fact black has extra weaknesses on the king side. So yeah, we've got a few more moves, but we see that black wasn't able to create any counterplay on the king side, nor center. And yeah, this is positional domination by white. I really like that knight posted on h5, by the way. Now we take here, and after knight e2, black resigns. Material is equal, is even, but black has nothing here, and we'll soon play something like g5, we'll bring the queen, we'll play knight g3. We also attack the pawn on c5, yeah. I mean, total disaster for black. I think we can even play something like queen g5 here. Wow, if he takes. Okay, yeah, that's because we've got that knight on h5 and we control the g7 square. So this is what we're trying to achieve when we play the rabbinic setup. And yes, black, he could have played much better than this, but this is what he gets when he plays the standard King's Indians moves. d6, knight d7, a5, knight c5. And this is what we'll get in our games too, because this is what black usually does. Now we'll also take a look at other ways black can play, and we'll see if we can execute our kingside attack successfully. So we'll finish this chapter here. I hope this intro was useful, and from next chapter onwards we'll keep on studying the rabbinic setup, and then we'll move on to other systems black can play. So that's all for this chapter, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you.